In the spring of 1847, when New Haven's cobbled streets echoed with the rhythm of merchant carts and congregational sermons, a peculiar silence began to settle over one corner of the town. It was the kind of silence that cloaked brick walls and whispered between iron gates surrounding an orphan asylum on Whitney Avenue. Decades later, the asylum's name would vanish from records as if struck out deliberately. But behind that vanished name were testimonies, journal pages, and autopsy fragments, all pointing to a series of orphan deaths that baffled physicians and terrified reformers. While modern science dissects the past with cold precision, this case remains an infection it cannot cauterize. Something went very wrong inside that home, and someone made sure the story never reached Sunday sermons. The Haven Society for Destitute Children, founded in 1839, presented itself as a sanctuary from the scourge of street begging and cholera. It received regular donations from congregational elites and endorsements from Yale faculty. The institution, a two-story brick edifice flanked by ivy and linden trees, promised shelter, education, and moral instruction. Monthly bulletins praised the asylum's strict hygiene protocols and Christian curriculum. Local papers printed cheerful images of boys at slateboards and girls stitching samplers. To passers-by, the orphanage was a triumph of New England charity. But from the back gate, undertakers came far too often, and in the ledgers, entire names began to vanish before they reached adolescence. The institution's reputation in the autumn of 1847, Elijah Tappan, a traveling organ repairman from Lowell, Massachusetts, arrived in New Haven with a contract to inspect the harmonium at Christ the Redeemer Chapel. His boarding arrangement placed him in a cramped attic room overlooking the Haven Society for Destitute Children. Elijah's daily route took him past the orphanage gates, where he often saw the same child, pale, barefoot, standing at the boundary between the gravel path and the shadowed hedge line. The child never waved, never smiled. After 3 days, Elijah asked a vendor at the corner why the boy never came inside. The vendor only looked at the building and said, "They don't always go in, and they don't always come out." To understand how a place like the Haven Society garnered prestige while harboring such silent dread, one must first look at the social fabric of New Haven in the 1840s. At the time, the city was a crucible of industrial ambition and puritanical order. It was home to both Yale's elite and a growing underclass of Irish and Italian immigrants. Child labor was common in textile mills. Orphanhood, too, had risen in the wake of cholera outbreaks and industrial accidents. Reformers like Mrs. Abigail Winthrop and Reverend Linus Bray saw the Haven Society as a bulwark against moral decay. The institution's charter, signed in February 1839, outlined strict admission requirements. Children had to be between 5 and 12, exhibit no physical deformities, and be of sound racial and moral stock. Such language, while euphemistic, functioned as a filter for the city's anxieties. Dr. Alonzo Perkins, a Yale-affiliated physician and one of the asylum's earliest medical consultants, claimed in his inaugural address that the facility would operate under the principles of hygienic rationalism, integrating fresh air routines, controlled diet, and moral conditioning. A few surviving copies of his lectures, housed at the New Haven Historical Society, show diagrams of mental caloric cycles and behavioral temperance zones. To the public, this sounded like progress. But inside the halls of the Haven Society, it translated into experiments few outsiders ever questioned. The building itself, completed in 1841, was designed by architect Robert Milbank in the Italianate style, with arched windows, slender chimneys, and a bell tower that rang each morning at 6. Behind the symmetrical facade lay a rigid architectural logic. Children were segregated by gender and age, meals were regulated down to ounces, and dormitories were inspected nightly for contamination events. The staff, numbering 11, included 3 unmarried matrons, 1 chaplain, a rotating cohort of student volunteers from Yale's Divinity School, and Dr. Perkins himself. Corporal punishment was not only permitted but documented in logbooks as necessary corrections. Yet despite this structure, the institution had no official records of internal grievance processes. Letters from former employees, unearthed during a 1903 lawsuit, hint at a silent hierarchy maintained by fear. One dismissed nurse, Edith Bannon, wrote in her deposition, "I came to see that discipline meant disappearance. A child could be reprimanded one day, and his bed would be empty the next. We were told it was transfer or adoption, but no names followed." Oblique tours of the facility, offered every second Sunday, were tightly choreographed. Children memorized hymn verses and recited them in a designated parlor under the gaze of benefactors. Visitors were shown only the western wing, where the walls bore framed proverbs and the floors were scrubbed with vinegar. The eastern wing, where disciplinary rooms and the infirmary were housed, was inaccessible for sanitary reasons. Mrs. Abigail Winthrop herself led many of these tours, often accompanied by Yale trustees or the wives of state officials. No one questioned the institution's selective transparency. A local journalist, Oswin Crosley, attempted to question this image in an 1846 editorial titled "Beneath the Ivy." The piece raised concerns about funding discrepancies and the absence of alumni testimonies from the Haven Society. "Where do the graduates of this charitable experiment find themselves?" he wrote. "Why is there no evidence of their prosperity?" Within a month, Crosley was dismissed from the Connecticut Herald under circumstances his editor refused to explain. This culture of silence extended even to the city's clergy. The Reverend Linus Bray, despite being listed as the asylum's spiritual supervisor, rarely visited the premises in person. His sermons, however, invoked the Haven Society as a moral exemplar, citing it often as proof of New Haven's divine favor. In private, according to diary fragments attributed to his assistant, Bray feared the institution's growing reliance on experimental medical routines. "They have removed prayer from the treatment ward," the assistant wrote in 1845. "They claim science now governs suffering." By late November of 1847, a frost had crept into the city and seemed to settle most stubbornly around the orphanage grounds. Elijah Tappan, still repairing chapel instruments, became increasingly unsettled by the irregularities he witnessed across the street. He noted in his personal journal, now archived at the Lowell Antiquarian Library, that smoke ceased to rise from the eastern chimney most mornings, despite the cold. Children's voices, once audible during the day, vanished entirely after dusk. More troubling, Elijah observed black-clad men carrying covered stretchers through the service entrance on 3 separate occasions, always after midnight. None of these movements appeared in local obituaries or city mortality reports. To understand how these disappearances and silences persisted, one must confront the collusion of civic, academic, and religious power in New Haven during the 1840s. The Haven Society was not merely a charitable entity, it was a nexus. Yale Medical School, under Dean Leopold Kingsbury, quietly referred select students to the asylum as part of practical developmental observation rotations. Though not officially part of the curriculum, these placements allowed aspiring physicians to monitor behavioral patterns, administer tonics, and record autopsy data under Dr. Alonzo Perkins' supervision. In return, the institution received medical supplies, anatomical literature, and a veneer of scholarly legitimacy. A surviving logbook from a Yale intern named Thaddeus Merritt, dated September 1847, includes entries such as Child 11A, subject to night tremors and dermal pallor, treated with lithic vapors, non-responsive, and Child 6B, extreme docility following Phase 3 diet restriction. While these notations offer no overt confessions of malpractice, they mirror techniques later criticized in the 1872 Connecticut inquiry into unregulated juvenile experimentation. Meanwhile, the town's leading newspaper, the New Haven Courier, continued to publish laudatory articles about the asylum. A September piece featured a photo engraving of children at prayer with a caption that read, "Purity preserved by order." None of the children in the image were identified by name. This editorial distance kept the institution shrouded in abstraction. Readers were encouraged to praise the concept of the orphanage, not the individuals within it. Personal stories, if they existed, were erased by policy. In the asylum's administrative ledgers, whole months show no record of discharges, adoptions, or fatalities. Yet several children who appear in the 1846 census, such as Nathaniel Brand, age 9, or Lydia Mayweather, age 7, are absent from all subsequent school rosters and city registries. One nurse, Miriam Polt, who later testified anonymously in an 1851 reform pamphlet, claimed the children were being subjected to interruption protocols, a term used internally to describe the abrupt removal of a child from all routine schedules without explanation. According to her account, these children were often taken to a locked infirmary suite on the basement level and never returned to the dormitories. "I was told by Matron Caldwell that the Lord takes some children sooner than others," Polt wrote, "but I never saw the Lord carry them out, only Dr. Perkins and the Yale men with the wheeled stretcher." Questions were occasionally raised during annual review meetings, attended by select donors and city aldermen. One such meeting, recorded in the minutes of November 1847, includes a brief exchange where a board member inquired about the institution's higher-than-expected chloroform expenditures. Reverend Bray redirected the question to Dr. Perkins, who replied that certain cases require additional sedation to facilitate restfulness and reduce discord. The matter was not pursued further. Even within the orphan population, knowledge of what occurred behind the locked eastern wing was fragmented and contradictory. A collection of drawings recovered from a fire-damaged storage crate, now preserved at the New Haven Public Library, depict figures bound to chairs, faces without eyes, and staircases that lead to blank walls. Though childlike in execution, the illustrations suggest a shared vocabulary of fear. No staff ever acknowledged their origin. During this period, a strange trend emerged in the surrounding neighborhood. Stray dogs, previously a common sight, vanished. Local cats stopped congregating near the alley behind the orphanage's kitchens. An apothecary named Silas Noonan, whose back window faced the orphanage's waste chute, complained in a letter to city health officials that the usual refuse had been replaced by foul pinkish sediment and scorched cloth bundles. No inspection followed. The asylum's public image remained resilient, propped up by its alliances and ritualized praise. At a December 1847 charity gala hosted at the Yale Club, Mrs. Abigail Winthrop gave a speech titled "Grace in the Labor of Care," where she described the children as budding lilies disciplined by winter to bloom come spring. The speech was reprinted in pamphlets circulated across Connecticut and praised in the Hartford Examiner. None of the children were in attendance. By Christmas, Elijah Tappan had grown deeply disturbed. He sought out the chapel rector, Father Ellery, and recounted his observations. Ellery, though sympathetic, urged discretion. "Many good men are involved," he cautioned. "Do not mistake method for malice." But Elijah persisted, visiting city records offices and even speaking with an embittered former cook who had been dismissed from the Haven Society for insubordination. The cook, Ruth Derham, warned him not to pry further. "Ask too much, and you'll be listed as a disruption. They have a word for people like you. They call you the sick variable." On December 28, 1847, Elijah packed his belongings and left New Haven without completing his contract. His final journal entry reads, "The child at the gate is gone. No one replaced him. The hedge grows thicker by the day. I pray never to see those bricks again." But others would. And by the time someone finally pried open the orphanage's records, it would already be too late for most. The silence, once so carefully cultivated, had begun to leak through the cracks. Shall I proceed to Chapter 2? Ignored signs in January of 1848, winter swallowed New Haven whole. The snow fell with a silence that matched the atmosphere inside the Haven Society for destitute children. The streets around Whitney Avenue became impassable for days, leaving the orphanage isolated behind its wrought-iron gate. Within the town, families huddled against the cold, while fires burned constantly within the homes of the wealthy. Yet across from the ivy-shrouded institution, the chimneys remained curiously inert. That same month, a woman named Flora Samuels began employment as a seamstress for the orphanage. She had been recommended by Mrs. Winthrop's Ladies' Auxiliary, a group devoted to charitable acts through textile work and scripture distribution. Flora, a widow and former servant of the Chamberlain estate, was considered respectable, discreet, and most importantly, unlikely to ask unnecessary questions. She was tasked with mending linens and winter garments in the basement workroom near the service stair. Her appointment would prove accidental but crucial, for she kept a written account, meant originally for her sister in New London, that would become one of the few surviving day-to-day testimonies from inside the Haven Society. In her first entry, dated January 12th, Flora described the workroom as chill and damp, like a place not meant for breath or thread. She noted the odd layering of the floorboards, as if parts had been removed and replaced with mismatched timber. But it was not the architecture that disturbed her. It was the sound. A humming, she wrote, but not like voices, like lungs under stone. The kind of air that isn't free. Flora's presence among the children was limited. She was forbidden from entering the dormitories or the infirmary, and was escorted between her station and the rear entrance by a silent kitchen porter named Felix. Still, she observed enough. The children pass my door but never meet my eye. Their mouths move, but I hear no words. They do not smile. They do not cry. She also remarked that every child seemed to wear an identical expression, not vacant, not dull, but paused, as though waiting to resume a life denied. On January 20th, a small incident occurred that forced Flora into closer contact with the children. A boy named Samuel fell in the hallway outside the linen closet, tearing the seam of his coat. When Flora reached to examine the garment, she noticed something unusual. The lining was not standard wool, but a strange weave of hemp and wire thread. Embedded near the collar was a soft disc, sewn shut with surgical precision. When she asked about it, the matron on duty, Miss Eleanora Caldwell, replied that it was a monitoring patch, a term Flora had never heard. She was told never to tamper with the children's clothing again. Later that evening, Flora described the episode in her letter, adding, "They monitor not with care but with measurement, as if the children were not being raised but recorded." The sense of unease deepened when Flora began finding scraps of paper in the laundry loads. They were often smudged with ink or soap, but certain phrases stood out. One read, "They took her after fourth bell." Another, "My head is loud, but I must not speak it." And in one note, which Flora kept hidden in a folded hem, was a drawing of what looked like a child in a bed, surrounded by high wooden screens, with an eye hovering above the headboard. By February, the town began noticing peculiar absences. Families who had sponsored individual children, a common practice where wealthier households paid for one orphan's room and board, received no replies to their inquiries. One such family, the Barstows of Chapel Street, demanded to know why their sponsored child, Margaret Ellis, had not responded to their Christmas letter or returned their hand-knit scarf. They were told she had been adopted, but no surname, no destination, and no adoption date were given. The Barstows pressed further, only to receive a written admonition from Reverend Bray warning of improper suspicion in matters divinely arranged. Meanwhile, a medical student named Horace Beadle, who had assisted Dr. Perkins the previous autumn, quietly dropped out of Yale. He never returned to Boston, nor did he collect his personal effects from his dormitory. His disappearance was noted briefly by the campus paper, but dismissed as a nervous malady. His roommate later recounted anonymously that Beadle had become obsessed with the asylum. "He said the children don't blink like they should," the account reads. "Said the place doesn't just watch them, it listens." Flora Samuels, growing anxious, attempted to speak with another staff member, a janitor named Milton, about what she had seen and heard. Milton refused. "I work where they don't look," he whispered. "You work where they do. Leave it at that." By March, the ice began to thaw. With the return of warmer winds, the orphanage resumed its controlled Sunday visits. Public trust had not wavered. An editorial in the Connecticut Gazette proclaimed the Haven Society a fortress of decency in an age of confusion. An accompanying lithograph showed 3 girls weaving baskets under a verse from Corinthians. But to Flora, that image could not have been further from the truth. "There are no baskets," she wrote, "and the only verse they repeat is silence." During one of her final weeks, Flora was asked to assist with a shipment of fabric from the loading dock. Among the crates, she noticed one smaller box labeled simply "Returns." She watched as it was quietly handed to a man in a brown coat who presented no papers. When she asked Felix what it meant, he turned his face away and said, "They go back to the city, or what's left does." Flora Samuels left her post without giving notice in April 1848. She fled to New London, where she lived with her sister for the remainder of her life. Though most of her letters were lost or censored, a few pages were preserved in a private collection donated by her great-niece to the Yale Library in 1934. The notes remain uncatalogued, stored in a plain manila envelope marked Anomalies Domestic. But the institution did not falter. Its donors remained loyal, its directors continued their work, and no formal complaint was ever filed against the Haven Society for Destitute Children. In early April of 1848, a second voice attempted to break the silence. His name was Simon Farrier, a junior clerk at the city coroner's office. He had only held the post for 6 months and was regarded by his superiors as overly inquisitive. Farrier, 22 years old and recently relocated from Danbury, had no prior connection to the Haven Society. His interest began with a discrepancy. 2 unnamed juvenile corpses recorded within 5 days of each other, both marked with vague causes of death. Collapse due to exposure and internal failure undetermined. Both were received from the same address, 114 Whitney Avenue. Farrier consulted city death records and found nothing matching those entries in the public registry. He then inquired with the assistant mortician who had accepted the deliveries. The man, ruddy and irritable, refused to discuss the matter. "Orders came sealed," he said. "Don't mean nothing if it's paid." Curious and unsettled, Farrier sought out earlier coroner reports tied to the Haven Society. What he uncovered disturbed him. In the span of 2 years, 13 children had been processed through the city morgue from that institution, none with last names, and none followed by a burial license issued to family or sponsor. Instead, the bodies had been claimed for medical education purposes, a designation that required only a single physician's signature. Each was signed by Dr. Alonzo Perkins. On Farrier compiled his findings into a private memorandum and shared it with 2 others, a city registrar named Miriam Dawes and a night shift nurse at the New Haven Clinic, Elliot Crandall. Both corroborated seeing irregular patterns in the asylum's reporting. Dawes noted that she had been instructed on several occasions to file children under Miscellaneous Urban Orphanage, NE sector, rather than use the institution's actual name. Crandall described an instance where a child was brought in for observation from the Haven Society, kept overnight under restraint, and returned before sunrise, without diagnosis. His pupils were dilated, Crandall said. He spoke, but the words were wrong. They didn't match the movements of his mouth. When Farrier presented these collected accounts to his supervisor, he was told in no uncertain terms to drop the matter. The Haven Society, he was reminded, was a legally protected charitable entity with ties to both Yale University and the Congregational Network. Any inquiry into its affairs required clearance from multiple boards, none of which had any record of malfeasance. "There are channels," the supervisor said. "This is not one of them." Undeterred, Farrier approached the editor of a minor reformist publication known as the Connecticut Watchtower. The editor, Emery Leeds, agreed to review the documents and consider an exposé. He promised a follow-up meeting. Farrier never received it. 3 days later, the offices of the Watchtower were raided on a vague warrant related to unlicensed agitation materials. Leeds was fined and the entire spring issue was pulped before distribution. On Farrier's memo survived only in fragments, later cited anonymously in a 1912 state inquiry into institutional abuses. His original draft was never recovered. Following the collapse of his investigation, he was reassigned to the Archive Division and never promoted. He left no personal correspondence and died in obscurity in 1891. Back within the walls of the Haven Society, changes were underway. Dr. Alonzo Perkins resigned from his post, citing philosophical divergence with administrative priorities. He was replaced by a younger physician, Dr. Roland Stether, known for his work on pediatric compliance studies at the Philadelphia Institute. Public statements claimed Perkins had been called to lecture abroad, but no records place him outside Connecticut after 1848. According to one unverified diary entry from a local bookseller, Perkins was seen entering the asylum late at night, weeks after his resignation, carrying a small wooden box and escorted by two men who wore no identifiable uniforms. Flora Samuels, having resettled in New London, attempted once to contact a church official in New Haven about what she had witnessed. The letter was intercepted. Instead of a reply, she received an unsigned note. What you think you saw was care. What you remember was protection. Protect others now by forgetting. Such warnings were not isolated. A schoolteacher who volunteered briefly at the orphanage later claimed her cousin received a similar message after she attempted to write a column on child welfare for the Hartford newsletter. They send you language, she said, not threats, not denials. Just the right words to sew your mouth shut. And yet, signs continued to emerge. Two children who had run away from the Haven Society were briefly sheltered by a woman named Constance Levere, who ran a boarding house near Hamilton Park. She described them as mute, frightened, and unwilling to sleep indoors. One had a series of small circular scars on the back of his scalp. Both were retrieved within 48 hours by a man identifying himself as an asylum chaperone. Neither was heard from again. Constance later claimed she was warned not to interfere in state-arranged custody cases. By the end of 1848, the asylum's internal structure had tightened further. Visits were reduced, staff turnover increased, children were rarely seen in the yard. Even the morning bell, once a daily ritual, rang irregularly, if at all. But outside the gates, the institution's reputation remained pristine. It was praised in year-end church bulletins and awarded another round of municipal funding. The building itself was nominated for inclusion in a pamphlet titled Architectures of Charity, to be printed by the Yale Press. The children, the notes, the drawings, the disappearances, all remained unseen beneath the surface of benevolence. No single voice was loud enough, and those who tried to speak often found themselves rewritten or erased. Horror Uncovered coming next. Shall I? Horror uncovered on September 14, 1849, a fire broke out in the rear annex of the Haven Society for Destitute Children. The flames were quickly contained, thanks to early detection and the close proximity of a Yale-affiliated fire brigade, but not before significant smoke damage blackened the infirmary corridor and destroyed several storage rooms in the eastern wing. At the time, the event was reported as a minor electrical mishap, an odd designation considering the building had no electricity. City newspapers described the incident as a regrettable but harmless accident, with no injuries and minimal loss. But for a group of university apprentices dispatched to help with cleanup, what they discovered under the scorched beams would rupture the illusion. These apprentices, part of a civic engineering program led by Professor Alden Lusk, were assigned to assist in structural assessment and salvage operations. One student, Jeremiah Holt, kept a field diary. His entries were methodical, technical, filled with jargon typical of mid-century architecture studies, until September 16th. That day, Holt and two peers were sent to the basement to examine soot integrity near the boiler shafts. Instead, they found what Holt would later describe as sealed vaults not listed on any diagram, lined with clay tiles and lead piping, with internal drainage but no apparent ventilation. The first chamber, only partially collapsed, contained 3 wooden cots and a metal cabinet. Inside the cabinet were dozens of small files, each labeled with indecipherable codes and dates. No paperwork was attached. The second chamber, fully intact, had walls etched with sequential numeric grids, possibly calendars or dosage logs, and a crude mirror bolted to the far side. Scorched rags and broken restraints littered the floor. Most disturbing was what Holt called the slop trough, a recessed cavity with rust-lined edges still wet when they entered. Holt immediately informed Professor Lusk, who filed a confidential report with the university's trustees. It was never submitted to city authorities. Instead, the site was sealed within days, officially designated unsafe for further exploration. The orphans were relocated temporarily to a church annex, and reconstruction began. During that brief displacement, local physician Walter Hemsley conducted an unofficial health screening of 6 children from the Haven Society. His notes, later smuggled to a Philadelphia medical journal, revealed alarming trends: unusually low resting heart rates, disproportionate pupil dilation, and reflex delay consistent with over-sedation or repetitive electromuscular manipulation. Hemsley was subsequently discredited for lack of methodological rigor and barred from publishing in Connecticut thereafter. But not all voices were silenced. A former instructor named Thomas Keene, who had resigned under mysterious circumstances in 1846, resurfaced in Boston that winter to deliver a lecture titled Disruption in Juvenile Cognition, a Field Warning. Hosted at a private assembly of abolitionist-aligned physicians, the lecture contained no direct reference to the Haven Society, but its content matched known practices. Keene described techniques used to disassociate persistent memory from immediate sensory engagement, involving isolated confinement, periodic nutritional shock, and repetitive auditory cues. Such methods, he warned, create not children, but blank receptacles, ideal for obedience, empty of will. A transcribed version of Keene's lecture circulated briefly among social reform circles. One recipient, a young teacher named Hannah Sturgis, traveled to New Haven under the guise of applying for a position at the asylum. Her application was denied, but she remained in town interviewing local merchants, church officials, and even attempting to speak with orphans who had passed through the system. What she found was less information than absence. "There are no former orphans," she wrote in a private letter. "They do not linger in town, they do not return, they do not write." One boy she did manage to contact, through an intermediary at the train depot, was named Clive Morgan, age 14. He had fled the asylum 2 years earlier and survived by boarding canal boats and hiding in freight crates. His description of the Haven Society was stammered, fragmentary, but consistent with other accounts. "They make you sleep with the red wires," he said. "You dream of numbers, and then you forget your name." When Sturgis pressed for more, Clive fled. 3 weeks later, he was found dead near a culvert north of Derby, an apparent fall. No investigation followed. Reshure began to build quietly behind institutional doors. Yale medical students circulated an anonymous petition to cut ties with the Haven Society. 37 signed. All were expelled for academic misconduct and breach of ethics. Their records were sealed. One professor who supported the students, Dr. Simon Elliott, was placed on indefinite leave. He left Connecticut soon after and never returned. Inside the asylum, changes in routine hinted at further concealment. Windows in the eastern dormitories were fitted with internal shutters. Deliveries of medical supplies increased, but were signed for by unidentified proxies. And the chapel, once a site of public tours, was repurposed as a locked archive room. Even the bell tower ceased to ring. A brief glimmer of accountability appeared in December 1849, when a city alderman named Elias Crowley requested an independent audit of orphanage finances. The request was approved, then quietly reassigned to a firm based in Providence. Their findings, released months later, confirmed the Haven Society's bookkeeping reflected modest expenditures and no irregularities. Crowley resigned from public service 2 weeks later. In a final letter to a friend, he wrote only, "They were never meant to grow, they were meant to fit." By the turn of 1850, the Haven Society had effectively erased the fire from its narrative. The rebuilt wing was presented in spring pamphlets as a renewal of sacred space, with new bedding, expanded instruction rooms, and state-aligned educational resources. No mention was made of the lost records, the hidden chambers, or the children who had vanished from the ledgers entirely. On January 3, 1850, a shipment of second-hand furniture arrived at the Haven Society from a defunct boarding school in New Hampshire. Included in the consignment was an upright writing desk, delivered to the instructors' quarters. What the deliverymen did not notice, and what a newly appointed tutor named Leah Bannerman later discovered, was that the desk contained a false panel. Behind it, sealed inside a waxed cloth sleeve, was a thick ledger with notes written in multiple hands. Most entries were dated 1846 through late 1848. The header on the first page read, "Receptive Trial Subjects, Monitor Cell Tracking." Bannerman, a quiet and methodical woman with experience in estate accounting, recognized immediately that the book did not belong among standard institutional documents. The ledger contained child identifiers, coded names, physical metrics, dosage records, and what appeared to be a series of recurring terms: reflex override, tonic retention, and signal. Compliance achieved. Dozens of pages included diagrams of the human nervous system, annotated with voltage estimates and procedural durations. One page bore a chilling phrase, circled in ink: "Silence is the optimal calibration." Bannerman took the book home and began to copy select portions into private notebooks. Over the course of 3 months, she attempted to verify the initials and entries, cross-referencing them with daily attendance logs and meal rosters. Her efforts revealed a consistent pattern. Each time a child was moved to monitor cell status, they disappeared from communal activities within 2 weeks. Several initials from the ledger matched children whose names no longer appeared anywhere else. In April 1850, Bannerman sought out a former asylum nurse, Miriam Polt, who had since relocated to a remote parish outside Trumbull. Polt confirmed that monitor cells had once been a euphemism for rooms used in extended sedation experiments. "We were told it was kindness," she said, "to give the children peace. But peace should not be measured in milliliters." Realizing the scale of what she had found, Bannerman traveled to Hartford and attempted to contact a journalist named Joseph Clendell, known for his exposés on labor conditions. She never reached him. On her return to New Haven, her room was searched. The original ledger was missing. Her own transcriptions, however, had been stored separately, hidden behind the stone frame of her hearth. She fled that night and left behind only a note: "What they broke was not the law, it was the child." Bannerman's documents would resurface decades later in the hands of a private collector and serve as the basis for the suppressed 1918 manuscript, Halls of Compliance, a thinly veiled fictionalization of the Haven Society's experiments. Yet in 1850, no public action followed her departure. If anything, the Haven Society grew more insulated. Yale renewed its patronage, citing disciplinary stability and environmental predictability as core strengths. The asylum began receiving orphans not only from New Haven, but from surrounding towns, often via unsigned transfers. Children arrived without known surnames, sometimes in the middle of the night. City registrars were discouraged from maintaining independent records. In May, a young gravedigger named Rufus Cleary, employed at the Potter's Field west of town, noticed an uptick in juvenile burials, always in unmarked plots. Most arrived in rough pine boxes, accompanied by vouchers signed only with initials. Cleary kept his own log. In one entry he wrote, 8 small caskets in 11 days, no prayers, no names, just the rain. Anonymity had become procedural. Internal documents within the asylum now referred to children not by name, but by numerical designation and compliance category. The system, once hidden, had become self-sustaining. One of the last known children to escape the institution was a girl recorded in various unofficial accounts only as N. She was found in July 1850, wandering near the old granary with bloodied feet and an oversized coat. Taken in by an elderly weaver named Daniel Varnum, she remained mute for several weeks. When she began to speak, it was in fragments, often repeating sequences of numbers, phrases from hymnals, and the word hollow. Varnum documented her behavior in a set of journals later discovered in a tin box beneath his floorboards in 1909. "She does not respond to her name," he wrote. "I call her Grace, but she looks through me. She won't eat unless I recite the first line of Psalm 25. When the church bell rings, she cries and scratches at the floor. The doctor says she's touched. I think she's remembering." Grace, or N, disappeared one night during a thunderstorm. Her blanket was left folded. The door was not forced. Varnum, already elderly, died soon after. No further trace of the girl was ever found. By autumn, the orphanage had ceased all public tours. Windows remained shuttered. The main gate was chained permanently. Only staff, students, and designated clergy were permitted entry. The few townspeople who still walked past it said the building looked heavier than it once had, as if the brick itself had thickened under the weight of something unspeakable. Inside, the final generation of the Haven Society's children were being processed, not raised, not taught, but measured, recorded, and erased. Silence had been perfected. Legacy and silence coming next. Shall I? Legacy and Silence. In the spring of 1851, an investigative committee formed by the Connecticut Board of Public Charities quietly convened in Hartford to review educational institutions across the state. On its agenda, buried among reports on almshouses and rural schools, was a single mention of the Haven Society for Destitute Children. The item was marked for Internal Administrative Consistency Review. No public statements were issued, no community input was sought, and when the committee adjourned 2 weeks later, the Haven Society's line item had vanished from the record altogether. By that summer, the orphanage was no longer referred to by name in any government documentation. It had become, instead, an anonymized line on city ledgers. Juvenile Care Structure, Whitney District. Yet the building remained open. Its iron gate still groaned on its hinges each morning. The brick was darker now, stained with decades of coal smoke and indifference, and inside, the experiments continued. But by 1852, cracks began to widen, not just in the walls, but in the system of containment that had protected the institution for over a decade. In June, a series of misfiled census slips from the ward's public school district were discovered. Among them were names of orphaned children previously believed deceased or relocated, still listed under the Haven Society's official roll. The slips had been filed by a clerk named Verity Sloan, who had transcribed names from a forgotten parish roster instead of the official city ledger. Her error, small and procedural, exposed a gap in the constructed narrative. Several children who were officially adopted or removed due to illness were in fact never moved at all. Sloan, curious about the discrepancy, cross-checked burial records and sponsorship logs. What she found disturbed her. There were more adoptions on paper than physical departures from the institution. Some children had been adopted more than once, listed with different sponsors in different years. When Sloan brought this to the attention of her supervisor, she was dismissed for improper access to protected registries. In response, Sloan smuggled copies of the documents to a friend at the New Haven Daily Eagle. The friend, Linwood Dursey, published a thinly veiled editorial titled Ghosts of the Gate. It ran only once. By the next issue, the entire editorial page had been replaced by a retraction and a general statement of support for the city's benevolent institutions. Dursey was fired. His printing press was seized under a technical violation of the stamp tax law. That same month, Yale quietly ended its affiliation with the Haven Society. No announcement was made. The reason cited in internal correspondence was public image inconsistency with long-term philanthropic priorities. The university took care to reroute all pediatric training placements to the newly established clinic at Dwight Street. Within weeks, student visits to the asylum ceased. The eastern wing of the building, once teeming with lab coat-clad observers, fell into a strange dormancy. With Yale's retreat came a drop in institutional funding. For the first time since its founding, the Haven Society began to struggle publicly. Donation appeals grew more frequent, often written in a tone of veiled desperation. One pamphlet from 1853 reads, "A generation abandoned must not be a generation lost. It includes no images of children." As public interest waned, a new generation of social workers emerged. Many of them raised on the rhetoric of the early reform movement, but disillusioned by its outcomes. Among them was Eliza Thorndale, a former assistant at the State Orphan Inspector's Office. Thorndale, by then a critic of institutional care, authored a widely circulated essay titled "Beneath the Roof of Charity," in which she challenged the moral authority of orphan homes. That did not publish exit records or alumni testimonials. Without naming the Haven Society directly, she described a brick-walled ministry of silence where the only graduation is vanishing. Thorndale's essay led to a minor reform wave. By 1855, new regulations required institutions to submit annual updates on child well-being, including educational advancement and placement history. Every active home complied, except one. The Haven Society filed an exemption request on the basis of archival losses due to fire. The exemption was granted. The name of the approving officer was redacted in the final version. That same year, a man claiming to be a former Haven child arrived in Boston and gave a testimony to a regional congress on child labor and welfare. He identified himself only as J.H. and described a regimen of sedation, sensory isolation, and electric learning. His account, written in longhand and preserved by Boston's Historical Commission, includes the following sentence. "They called us resonance. They said the future needed more quiet minds." The transcript was dismissed by conference attendees as the invention of an unstable man. Within New Haven, the building itself began to erode. Its gutters failed. Rats returned to the dormitory eaves. Sections of the brick began to bow outward. By the end of the decade, it was a structure out of time, no longer endorsed, no longer useful, but still standing. Local children avoided the sidewalk nearest its gate. Shopkeepers spoke of the building in past tense, though they could see its shadow stretch each dusk. And then, quietly, the doors closed. No official notice was given. No ceremony marked the end. Sometime in the spring of 1857, the gate was chained permanently, the shutters bolted shut. The last of the staff moved out under night cover. Over the next year, rain peeled away paint. Ivy overtook the fence, and the Haven Society for Destitute Children disappeared from the city's vocabulary. Not through fire, not through scandal, but through engineered forgetting. By the autumn of 1858, the building that once housed the Haven Society for Destitute Children had become an architectural ghost. Its brickwork, once a symbol of moral order and public virtue, was now veined with rot. The front gate, rusted shut and half obscured by overgrowth, bore no nameplate. Nearby residents began referring to the place only as the Shell. Its windows stared blankly, and its doors never opened. The silence around it became absolute. City officials debated what to do with the structure. It was technically municipal property now, reclaimed through a bureaucratic loophole that categorized unoccupied charitable holdings as abandoned philanthropic fixtures. An initial proposal to convert the space into a poorhouse was tabled indefinitely. An alternate plan to raise the site for housing never passed committee review. The building remained untouched, its files destroyed or missing, its ledgers scattered, its history quietly deleted. And yet, not everyone forgot. In 1862, amid the growing turmoil of the Civil War, a traveling lecturer named Horatio Dalen began speaking across Massachusetts and Connecticut about misplaced children and lost architectures. His talks, always staged in small church basements or workers' halls, often drew modest but attentive crowds. Dalen spoke not of a single institution, but of a pattern. Homes where children entered and were never seen again, programs that tracked behavior more rigorously than health, and facilities where records were rewritten or withheld. He never named the Haven Society directly, but his references were unmistakable. "There are buildings," he once said, "where silence is the product, not the condition." Though dismissed by most as a crank, Dalen's words found fertile ground among a growing network of child welfare reformers. By the 1870s, national efforts to regulate orphan care began in earnest, driven not only by science and policy, but by the lingering whisper of places like the Haven Society. The institution's name was almost never cited, but its shadow could be seen in new legislation. Rules about inspection access, mandates for child tracking, protocols for psychological evaluation. A new system was being built atop the ruins of the old, brick by unreconciled brick. Meanwhile, the building itself refused to fall. In 1883, a severe windstorm toppled trees across New Haven. It stripped roofs from warehouses, smashed glass from City Hall, and uprooted 2 tenements. But the shell of the Haven Society remained intact. Investigators who ventured onto the grounds found the bell tower collapsed inward, the dormitory wing sagging, but the central corridor still dry, the old chapel floor unwarped. One police officer who entered during the inspection noted a strange sensation in the air, as if the hallway still remembered footsteps. In 1890, local real estate agents again proposed demolishing the structure. A crew was contracted, scaffolding was erected. But when the workers began, they found entire interior walls missing. Instead, behind plaster and lath, they discovered metal mesh, scorched support beams, and fragments of unmarked cabinets. A city surveyor noted that several passageways appeared non-Euclidean, an architectural term misapplied but revealing. The building, for all its apparent symmetry, had grown inward in irregular, undocumented ways. The demolition was halted, the proposal rescinded. Official records from the period cite budgetary complications. Unofficially, the workers refused to return. One foreman reportedly said, "You don't tear down a cage without knowing what was in it." By the turn of the century, the site became a cautionary landmark. Children dared each other to throw stones at its facade. New residents asked why the building had no name. Some called it a former hospital. Others said it was a reform school. The truth blurred. Memory faded. And with each passing year, the institution's purpose and its horrors slid further into obscurity. In 1918, during the height of the influenza epidemic, a physician named Harold C. LaRue recovered a stack of documents from the estate of an eccentric historian in Providence. Among the papers was the nearly complete manuscript of Halls of Compliance, believed to be derived from Leah Bannerman's hidden notebooks. Though fictionalized, the manuscript described a charitable asylum, where children were subjected to neurological experiments designed to train the moral impulse through silence. LaRue attempted to publish it. No press accepted. The manuscript was filed under psychological satire in the Yale Rare Books Archive, mislabeled and uncatalogued for nearly 60 years. In 1971, urban developers planned a renovation project along the Whitney Avenue corridor. By then, the shell had fully collapsed. Ivy choked its entrances. Windows were filled with concrete. A public vote passed to replace the site with a memorial park. During the excavation, workers found beneath the old foundation a sealed sub-basement not indicated in any city plans. Within it were rows of rusted cots, glass bottles and bolts embedded in the floor. No press release followed. The basement was resealed and covered with decorative gravel. Today, that park contains a small plaque. It bears no date, no names. It reads only, "Here the silence was learned." The legacy of the Haven Society was not a lesson. It was a procedure. And it worked. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way, we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.